Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Reaction Show. My name is Andrew Velez. I'm here with my co-host, Mr. Joel Dels. Happy Thanksgiving, or I should say happy belated Thanksgiving. Of course, we celebrated Thanksgiving this past week. We just watched some Sunday night football. We had a good slate of football games this entire weekend. Let's be completely transparent. But you see what I'm rocking. You know what I'm here to talk about a little bit, at least a little bit today. But Mr. Dubs, before we get into all of that, how are you doing today, and how was your Thanksgiving?
Had a great Thanksgiving. Your Denver Broncos gear has been getting a lot of use recently. It's been getting a lot of use. Hottest team in football right now. Another W. Biggest test. Maybe not biggest, but one of the hottest teams are going to be coming next week going up against
Definitely.
the Houston Texans. But you take the W today. But no, been good. We got a little bit of a break. Didn't have a second episode this week for Pick a Side, but we'll be back for a full-length podcast tomorrow talking about all of the games. Today will just be fantasy football, of course. But we have a lot of fantasy football stuff to get into. I mean, there was a lot of highs, a lot of lows, and I'm feeling good, but I don't think I'm feeling as good as you, who in our main league 2-week playoff started this week. You're up, 60 points, 70 points
Something
going into
70.
the week two of
Yeah,
the first week of the playoffs, the first round of the
ve- ve-
playoffs.
very calm 70-point lead right now going into Monday Night Football, where my opponent, shout out to my brother Joey, he has Justin Fields going up against Minnesota. So it's not like he's not completely out of it. Of course, it is 2-week playoffs. We've seen some things happen. But I have the bomb squad, and it really went off. And it starts with the guy who this video is about a little bit. Mr. Jalen Hurts goes into the third quarter with 5 points somehow, some way. I shouldn't say that because that's just who he is. Mr. Jalen Hurts is going to find himself in the end zone one way or another. 5 touchdowns, goes ahead and finishes with 34, almost 35 fantasy points. I mean, he is sensational. He is the MVP. Now, before we get into all that conversation, because yes, I'm through the moon already. You guys know how much I love Jalen Hurts, but I don't love him as much as this man over here to my left, to your right. I don't know which way it's going to go, but let's talk about this Sunday night football game real quick, and then we'll move on to the real highlight, the real, probably the game of the year with the Buffalo Bills and the Philadelphia Eagles. The Ravens Chargers. We could talk about this briefly just because we pay respect to the main event ball game. 20-10. Ravens come away with the W going into their bye week. Now, any strong takeaways from this game? I mean, the only one to me that really stands out, I expected more from this Ravens offense. Only 20 points going up against the league's worst defense in the Los Angeles Chargers. But this Chargers team, it's just lacking something. And I just don't know if I can pinpoint just one thing because it seems as if there's a lot wrong with it right now.
It felt like one of the better Chargers performances of the season, at least defensively. For 55 minutes of this game, they held the Baltimore Ravens to 13 points. They were able to gash them pretty much all game, at least on the ground. They had multiple players that were able to find some success, but through the air, they did a good job limiting them. I mean, you look at the Baltimore receiving core was led by Isaiah Likely, who had 40 yards, Odell
Yep.
Beckham, 3 for 34, Zay Flowers, 5 for 25. So the Chargers defense, a very nice surprise that they showed up to play. And they've had these moments here and there throughout the season, even against the Cowboys, limiting them to 20 points. They've had some time every once in a while, but it always gets overshadowed because they have some big blunder or big game like the Packers a week ago where they just absolutely blow it. So not a ton of takeaways, right? I think Justin Herbert, probably a bit of a disappointment. Of course, you only get 1 touchdown, 217 yards. We did get 47 rushing yards. I think the only thing that's interesting is the Baltimore rushing attack. It's another week where I don't know if we learned a ton. We had, for the first time, I thought Keaton Mitchell down the stretch was the guy, right? I think we've seen a lot of Gus Edwards, but that second to final drive outside of the kneel downs, it was Keaton Mitchell on the field, getting the ball in the passing game. So I think that's a great sign that the Ravens are trusting him in those situations where at this point it was, 13-10. This was a must-have situation. They wanted him on the field over Gus Edwards, over Justice Hill, who's turned into the pretty clear RB3 on this team. But outside of Keaton Mitchell gained a little bit of trust, and even still, he had 1 more carry than Gus Edwards, so it's not like he's taking a stranglehold on this backfield. We didn't learn a ton. Isaiah Likely is going to be involved, 6 targets, 4 for 40. But even still, when you have some injuries here, Zay Flowers got the 2 touchdowns. It's going to look great, when you look at game logs and say, wow, Zay Flowers is going to be one of the top receivers. But then you see it's 5 for 25 and a touchdown, and it was one rush for 37 yards and a touchdown. So I don't know if that's something that's going to be sustainable week in and week out, that, you're going to get, was it 60 yards? One of them is a 140-yard rush and 2 touchdowns. So a happy game. I'm happy for Zay that he was able to get into the end zone after getting one called back last week. But overall, I don't know if I'm seeing this as an upgrade, even with Mark Andrews out.
Now let's highlight the main event on the Baltimore Ravens. That's, of course, Lamar Jackson. Now, since we made that clip of is Lamar Jackson just locked and loaded top 3 finish in fantasy football, where it seemed as if it was written in the stars. Quarterback 28, quarterback 18, 16. Did bounce back week 4 against Cincinnati, had himself a great ball game. But then this past week, where it sits right now, he is quarterback 14. Now, it is sometimes situation where they're absolutely smoking teams and they don't need Lamar Jackson to really go above and beyond. And of course, fantasy managers aren't the biggest fans of that. But in a situation like this one versus the Chargers, where you had plenty takeaways on the defensive side of the ball, you had opportunities to score, and you only had 3 points off of turnovers. To me, it goes hand in hand with, yes, the Chargers did have a very solid game defensively, surprisingly, I should say. But then also, it can go hand in hand with, we saw this run offense be relatively efficient. It was just this passing game lacked that consistency, and maybe it's due part to no longer having the safety blanket that is a Mark Andrews. But like you mentioned, it leading the way tonight was an Isaiah Likely at the tight end position too. You're never going to replace Mark Andrews. Of course, he's just way too much of a force. But it is interesting, and I don't want to go as far to say worrisome, because Lamar Jackson's obviously still in MVP contention. But when it comes to fantasy football, you have no choice but to start him as your quarterback 1, even in quarterback 1 in 1 QB leagues, just because of how dominant that he can be on any given week. But just going off the numbers and how he's performed these last 4 or 5 games, I mean, I'm just stating the facts. He hasn't been the dominant fantasy force we've seen him early on in the season.
No, he hasn't been. We're talking about some great matchups too. It starts with Arizona in week 8, where he's QB 28, Seattle week 9, QB 18. You could look at that and say, well, they were blowing them out. Then followed up Cleveland, QB 16. That was a game that was back and forth. Last week in Cincinnati got back on track, QB 4. But then you mentioned this game against the Chargers that you're looking at, saying this is a game where Lamar Jackson should be in the QB 1 overall type conversation. And he comes out and has, about 200 total yards, 1 touchdown. So a bit disappointing from Lamar, and next week is a bye too. So, we're entering playoff mode for a majority of leagues. I'm sure week 14, week 15 or so is when your playoffs will be starting. So hopefully you have either the bye secured or you're locked up into playoffs, because you're not going to have him next week. The upside with Lamar is too great though, like you mentioned, to really play that game of having somebody else that's going to have that type of ceiling that he does. But disappointing week against the Chargers. I'm not looking too much into it.
And the last thing I'll say before we talk about this Bills and Eagles game, because that's a must. We have to give that a whole segment. But Eckler looked elusive. And I say that because I know that there were concerns about his speed after you and I were talking about it. You told me he, 13 miles an hour on that run?
13 miles an hour.
That is just not the Eckler that we know. It looked like he was running slow. It looked like something was just holding him back before he can get any type of momentum going. But he looked relatively good today. The numbers weren't there to back him up. 10 carries, 32 yards. Did have his 5 catches on 6 targets, 32 yards. Had that cool play that Keenan Allen goes and he catches the ball, but then throws it off to Austin Eckler to get the first down on 3rd and 17. Very cool play, but at least some bright spot to be taken away from this offense in terms of the worry that was Austin Eckler. I think he looks solid. But then, of course, Keenan Allen's going to be Keenan Allen. He's going to be one of the best wide receivers in fantasy football. And Herbert, coming off 2 back-to-back top 3 performances in fantasy football, puts up a minor dud. It's the Baltimore Ravens defense. They're just going to force turnovers. They're going to make you feel uncomfortable. They're going to get pressure on the quarterback. They did exactly that versus Herbert. Now, let's talk about the real main event of the day. The Bills versus the Eagles, probably the best game of the season. In the rain, these 2 quarterbacks were dueling it out, slinging the rock, running the ball. 37-34, Philadelphia squeaks away with the W. You see the title. You know what's coming. Jalen Hurts is the MVP of the 2023 NFL season. It's got to be what it is. to start as bad as you did in that first half, have a turnover, really not be effective in the passing game at all. I think he didn't even crack 100 passing yards in that first half. He couldn't do anything in the air, and then on the ground, it is what it is. The Bills defense executed a great game plan in that first half. It's a tale of two halves in the National Football League. I say this every single week we talk ball. He finishes with 5 total touchdowns, 3 in the air, 2 on the ground, has the game-winning touchdown with his legs. Joel, how is he this good? How?
Yeah, it's fun. It's so fun, man. And another week goes by down 17-7 at halftime. Was that the same score of the Chiefs Eagles last week
Ooh,
too? Was it
it
17-7?
was. It was.
Back-to-back weeks against Mahomes, against Josh Allen, down double digits at halftime, and it's just resiliency. That's the first word that comes to mind. It's
No doubt.
even when the Eagles are down, even when it was 17-7 at halftime, and even how great Josh Allen looked, because I think you can make the argument Josh Allen's been the second best quarterback in football this season. He's been so special. He's even in this loss where he has to lead the team and rushing yards.
He's
He
a
still
one-man
has
guy.
4 total
Yeah.
touchdowns, 400 total yards. Like Jalen Hurts is going to get all the credit this week. I'm sure MVP talks are going to go through the roof. But what Josh Allen today was special. Real quick though, just to give him his flowers. Jalen Hurts, there's just never a time where I feel worried. Like there's never a time, regardless of score, how much time's left on the clock, situation, down and distance, where I'm sitting there saying, I don't think Jalen Hurts is going to come out on top. 27-2 now in his last 29 games. He could go up big and secure the victory. He could go down by double digits at halftime against some of the best quarterbacks in football and go toe-to-toe with them in the second half, go into overtime. And that last drive was just so calm, so methodical. And part of that was on the Bills defense for playing a very off coverage, don't want to get beat down the field type of defense. But he took advantage of it. He had a multiple high-level throws, and then, of course, the rushing touchdown to finish off the game. It was a masterful performance from Jalen Hurts. And we look at the raw numbers. It's like 200 passing yards, a 54 quarterback rating. But if you watch in the key situations when he had to have it, the Eagles and Jalen Hurts always showed up.
Even on that, the last drive before going into overtime, goes and just makes smart play after smart play. Jason Kelce, who we rarely see him make any type of mistakes, has not one but 2 false starts, brings them back where they're almost out of field goal range after Jalen Hurts goes and does his dink and dunk job to get them into field goal range. Gets the field goal, goes and has the back against the wall again where the Bills are up 3. He has to put points up on the board. Great pass after great pass, smart play after smart play, does with his legs, able to get into the end zone. You're right. Timely plays, both just not just from Jalen Hurts, but also from this Philadelphia Eagles defense. They got gashed in their own right. You talked about it, Josh Allen, where we talk about how Jalen Hurts was the victor in this matchup. If you want to talk about who played better, Josh Allen is a one-man band. 339 yards, 2 touchdowns, had 2 rushing touchdowns himself, almost 100 rushing yards. He is the offense. He is the heart and soul of the Buffalo Bills. And it really is sad because my dad equates this to when he was watching Dan Marino. Dan Marino had no type of defense, but every single week you could bet that Marino was going to do everything he could to put points on the board to try and make it a 35-32 game. Put yourself in a position where, hey, I just have to put more points on the board than my defense is going to let up. And the Buffalo Bills defense has unfortunately been letting Josh Allen down. And in a game like this one where you're not going to stop the Eagles for an entire game, that's the truth of the matter. They're just too high potent of an offense right now. You got to get a couple of stops here and there, especially in that second half. You can't allow them to score 4 touchdowns in the second half and overtime. You're not going to win a ball game like that, even with Josh Allen playing as high level as he was. Did have that bad interception late in the game. That's definitely true. But what more do you want from him when he's doing legitimately everything? You're bound to make a mistake. Jalen Hurts can make a mistake, but still get away with it. But on the opposite side, you can't see that with Josh Allen and the Buffalo Bills. But all in all, we're talking about 2 MVP candidates. I think whoever came away with the W here would have launched themselves into higher contention. but it's just a matter of fact. Jalen Hurts walks off on a game-winning rushing touchdown, 5 total touchdowns on the game. It's got to be Jalen. If not Jalen, then who else at this point in time? Now,
Yeah,
I'm sure his
that's
name's
all I
gonna.
got.
Yeah, I mean he's insane.
All I got is
I'm
Jalen.
sure his name is going to be mentioned in this next segment. We're going to move on to our studs and duds at the quarterback position. Talk to me, Mr. Dells. Who are the studs of Week 12?
QB1, Josh Allen. QB2, Jalen Hurts. I mean, we just talked about them. It was the two best
It's a
performances
masterclass.
probably of this Week 12 here. Josh Allen goes for over 400 total yards and 4 touchdowns. Second time he's been QB1, 7th top 5 finisher than Jalen Hurts. As we mentioned, it was an ugly first half, turned it on in the second. 265 total yards, 5 total touchdowns. Also his 7th top 5 finish. And 2 of just one of the best games I think of Jalen Hurts, even though statistically wasn't there. One of the best games we have seen Jalen Hurts play this season. QB3, your guy, Dakota Prescott, had a bit of a heat check last week going up against the Carolina Panthers, but got right back to his elite ways. 330 passing yards, 4 touchdowns. He now has 5 top finishes in the top 5 in the last 6 weeks. He's just been unbelievable. Go for it.
So, to go hand in hand, because these are my 2 quarterbacks, Dakota Prescott, Jalen Hurts. How funny is it that I'm going to read you Jalen Hurts stats week to week, just the fantasy point totals? This should be in standard leagues. And the fact that not in one single week he's finished as quarterback 1 is hilarious. Here we go. Starting from week 2, 26 fantasy points, 22, 24, 28, 23, 24, 27, 26, 20, and 36 fantasy points. Not a single one has he finished number 1. At worst, he's been a top 10 fantasy quarterback in every single week, but last week versus KC, where he was quarterback 11. He has a quarterback 2, quarterback 3, quarterback 5, 5, 2, 3, and 4. He is on a different level and is right now right in hand with Josh Allen, who right now is the number 1 fantasy quarterback. He is right there with him as the fantasy kings right now.
If he's not going to get QB1 on a 34-point day, it just might not be in the cards.
What are you going to do? What are you going to do?
QB4 this week was CJ Stroud, 300 passing yards, 47 rushing, 3 total touchdowns. Came up a bit short at the end. Matt Amendola just missed the kick by a couple of yards. CJ Stroud's been phenomenal. Is he, because I'm looking at his upcoming schedule, Denver, Jets, Titans, Browns. I think you're fine starting against Denver, whose defense has improved, but it's CJ Stroud, the Titans too. When you're going up against the Jets and the Browns, is he still someone you're automatically starting?
I think versus the Jets, they're going to make any quarterback look normal. However, CJ has been on such a tear that if you are a fantasy manager and you feel as if you have no other option, start CJ. He's been that great. I don't want to say he's matchup proof because we haven't seen many quarterbacks go up against the Jets and be matchup proof. Look at this game with the Dolphins versus the Jets. You and I spoke. I think in real life football, Tua didn't play a bad game. But in fantasy football, we're going to be talking about him in our dud section. Just because the Jets are going to force you to turn the ball over. They're going to force you to play a different type of brand of football than you normally play, especially with a rookie quarterback, even though CJ Stroud's not a normal rookie. He is so far from a normal rookie that you still have to respect what the Jets defense is doing.
Absolutely. So QB5 on the week, bit of a surprise. Jordan Love, QB5 on the week, quarterback 7 on the year. Probably the biggest surprise because we did give him the Blake Bortles Award a few weeks ago, and this just has, just puts the ribbon on top because he hasn't been that great this year. But the last 3 weeks, 7 passing touchdowns, and is averaging nearly 300 passing yards per game. His upcoming schedule is the Chiefs, Giants, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Carolina Panthers, and the Minnesota Vikings to finish out the year. This was a very impressive game going up against the Lions, whose defense has been forgiving. They've been able to get beat up on, but being on the road, prime time, Thanksgiving, Packers have heard a lot of shit over these last few weeks, even though they won the previous week against the Chargers. Are you buying into this Jordan Love kind of resurgence in the middle of the season?
I've been very consistent. I don't think that he's bad. I don't think he's been playing bad. However, there have been moments that I'm looking at, especially that game versus the Raiders, and I'm left scratching my head. But that's going to happen as your first year starting in the National Football League. You're bound to make mistakes. But going up against the Lions, I can't say that I was surprised by this. Maybe top 5, of course, that's a stretch, but still going up against a weak secondary in the Detroit Lions, I anticipated he would have a good game, especially after watching the tape of these last 4 games from Jordan Love. He hasn't been bad. It's just there's been a lack of support on the outside with his receivers. Now, him blowing up could go hand in hand with Christian Watson finally breaking out. But again, this Detroit Lions secondary really has been poor. Saw Justin Fields and the Chicago Bears do their thing against them last week. And now you have this week on Thanksgiving where Green Bay was able to do whatever they wanted offensively. I can't be surprised this week, but I do have to give respect and acknowledgement to Jordan because, of course, end of the day, you got to go out there and execute. And that's exactly what he did.
Yeah, and plus matchups, there's not a ton to finish out the year. Like I mentioned, Chiefs, Giants, Bucks, Carolina, Minnesota.
For
But when he
sure.
does get a positive matchup, he could put up a solid week. Quarterback 6 was Trevor Lawrence. This is back-to-back great weeks for Trev. Today, he threw for over 360 yards, 2 total touchdowns. Does have Cleveland and Baltimore 2 out of the 3 next week, so not ideal, but I'm starting to feel more safe with his floor. We're seeing Calvin Ridley back-to-back weeks get involved. We'll talk about him later. Just overall raises the ceiling of this offense. QB7 is Matt Stafford. The whole Rams offense, they were able to do whatever they want against Arizona. We're going to be talking about, surprisingly, everybody in the stud section except wide receiver when it comes to the Rams.
Yep.
He had 230 yards and 4 passing touchdowns. Also has Cleveland and Baltimore the next 2 weeks. So I would expect a bit of regression from this Rams offense who looks so electric today. And to round out the top 10, we had Mahomes at QB8, Kyler at QB9, who it was a pretty ugly game for Kyler, but that's just who he is for fantasy. He could have an ugly game and still have a top 10 finish. And lastly, QB10 was Sam Howell. Even though they got blown out, Sam Howell's still going to put up numbers.
Yeah, I mean, it was a great week for fantasy quarterbacks, no doubt about it. But unfortunately, in the dud section, starting it off is going to be my guy, Mr. Tua Tagovailoa. Now, I said it. I think watching the game, I don't think he played bad by any means. You saw Tyreek Hill, you saw Jalen Waddle have blow-up games. And outside of those 2 turnovers, Tua played a relatively clean game in the second half, but really they relied on the run heavily. But for fantasy football, finishes with just under 10 fantasy points at 9.8. Did have the 2 INTs, did get into the end zone. Could have had another one if Tyree called that one in over Sauce. But again, difficult play to make. It is Sauce Gardner. You give him the respect. But 243 yards, a touchdown, 77.5 passer rating, 70% completion rate. That's just more so to go hand in hand with. You had the 2 INTs, kind of ruined his fantasy day. But again, did have a solid overall game. Came away with the W against a good Jets defense. Brock Purdy versus Seattle. This one I wasn't too sure if I wanted to mention, but he did have 11.5 fantasy points. They kind of just did whatever they wanted to Seattle. It was kind of close, but 209 yards, a touchdown, and 19. You're coming off this game where you absolutely lit up the stat sheet against, what was it, Tampa Bay. For him to finish his quarterback 20, not an ideal situation for Brock Purdy, but you expect better games to come. This wasn't, I guess you could say this is his floor game, but really we've seen his floor live around 250, 2 touchdowns, but the game script just didn't call for a Brock Purdy. Now, on the opposite side, you have Geno Smith, who finished as your just, I believe, just under 2-0 at quarterback 27, 8.3 fantasy points, 180 passing yards, 0 touchdown, and an INT. That Niners defense was dominant. Geno Smith really has been one of the bigger disappointments at quarterback for fantasy football. And I don't know if I feel comfortable going forward with Geno Smith. Even in 2 quarterback leagues, there's just got to be better plays unless the matchup's golden.
There has to be. He's been really all season long. You don't see the ceiling you saw last year from Geno Smith, the 30 touchdowns, these big blow-up performances. And, you've seen that kind of from most of the finishes. DK's gotten hot the last couple of weeks, but even the finishers from DK, Tyler Lockett, it's been very inconsistent all season long. And you have injuries now to the running backs. Of course, Kenneth Walker, this was his first game or second game missing now. Zach Charbonnet, I like him, but I don't think he brings the same type of juice overall. So that, again, is going to bring down the ceiling for this offense. So I'm not a fan of Geno Smith. If you have to in 2 quarterback leagues, this wasn't the matchup for you. The 49ers, since the bye week, have looked like an elite unit defensively. They showed up again this week.
Now, the last quarterback I want to mention is a quarterback that was going nowhere near anyone's lineups, but I feel like we have to talk about it because I feel like it is news. Mac Jones finishes as quarterback 32 on the week versus the New York Football Giants. Doesn't throw for over 100 yards, gets benched for the second half. Bailey Zappi comes in. Is this the last we've seen of Mac Jones?
In the Patriots uniform, I think. Yes.
Mhm.
I feel like I've always been a little bit higher on Mac Jones because I saw what he did his rookie year and an offensive system that was still broken even pre-Joe Judge, Matt Patricia days, because there still wasn't a ton of receivers. There wasn't a lot of explosiveness, and you had Bill Belichick. It's not like you had some great offensive mind there. And I saw what he did his rookie year, right? He put up good numbers. He looked in control of the offense. And we even said it when he was coming out of the draft that we kind of know what Mac Jones' floor is going to be. He's going to be a safe, middle of the pack type quarterback. But we knew what the ceiling was, which was Kirk Cousins. How he's playing now this year and last year too, I feel like this is even beyond his floor. I think if you put him in a competent system with decent pass catchers, you're going to see the Mac Jones we saw his rookie season. But right now, it feels more than just a play on the field. You hear the reports of the locker room. You hear the reports of Bill Belichick possibly leaving. This whole Patriots franchise, I think, is going to look completely different. By the time April comes around and draft season, could have a new head coach, could have a new quarterback, and Mac Jones is kind of lost in the middle of it all.
The issue with Mac Jones is his decision making is really bad, really bad. That interception that he threw right before half, just boneheaded. You're
Yeah.
trying to make something happen when you shouldn't. You throw it right to the Giants defender. He almost returns it for a pick six. You did the same thing against Indianapolis overseas. You've just had so many moments that leave fans scratching their head. You to go off what you were saying, you've shown us, Mac Jones, that you can be a competent quarterback. Your rookie season that you put forth was impressive football, especially for a rookie season. For you to have regressed this much, this quickly, is shocking. Now, it could go hand in hand with the lack of supporting cast, but we saw Ramondre have himself a great game. It's not like you don't have guys on that offense, although limited. Yes, I'll give you that help, that benefit of the doubt, Mac. You're not helping yourself by trying to play hero ball and making these boneheaded mistakes. I'm with you. I think his time is up in New England. But if you're not going to be a starting level quarterback in New England, I find it difficult to find another situation that you could be successful in or have another opportunity to be successful in. More importantly, what other teams are looking for a quarterback of Mac Jones's caliber? I guess you can go and you can look at a team like the Raiders right now who are starting in Aiden O'Connell, the Browns, but again, they have Deshaun Watson, who is out for the season, but he is signed long-term. You expect him to be their quarterback of the future moving forward. I just don't see many other opportunities for Mac Jones to go in and immediately have success. As of right now, it's looking as if Mac Jones will be a backup or at least a future backup quarterback for the foreseeable future. But let's move on because Mac Jones, unfortunately, is sad conversations. Let's go on and move on to our running back studs of week 12, sir.
Running back won by a mile, not even close. Kyren Williams, first game back from IR. Sean McVay says, screw your
We're
IR.
here.
16 carries for 143 yards, 6 receptions for 61 yards and 2 touchdowns, over 200 total yards of offense. This was the dream scenario. You made a huge move. It was so low key because typically in fantasy and your fantasy leagues, when you have this big time trade, it's like, this guy's getting
League
4
blows
players.
out.
You're giving up 3 superstars, and yours just like it was just like I don't remember what it was, like a Tuesday night or maybe early in the morning, whatever it might have been. And it's Deontay for Kyren Williams, and I don't even see it till like the next day or 2 days later. And I'm looking, I'm like, Drew just absolutely fleeced Kyren Williams. I don't know if G was our friend who had him.
Yep.
I don't know if he had a mental lapse, but it didn't. I didn't forget how dominant Kyren Williams was for fantasy football and the chokehold he had on this backfield before the injury. He came back, and I'm expected that Darrell Henderson or Royce Freeman, one of these guys, is going to cut into the workload. No way. Now, this matchup was beautiful. Arizona has been very forgiving to everybody. They do have Cleveland and Baltimore coming up, but there's not going to be a ton of guys that are going to get 20 plus touches. He looked phenomenal for what it's worth. This isn't just 200 total yards and it's like, yeah, but he got like 30 touches force fed. He looked great. He looked explosive. You saw the elusiveness there. He should be treated probably like a top 10 running back rest of season. Do you agree? I know you want to agree, but do you agree?
He's already had 5 top 10 finishes this season, and that is in due part with him missing 4 games this season. He's been awesome. He's been a fantasy dream. And going forward, I don't love the Cleveland and Baltimore matchups back to back, but Cleveland's rush defense, I guess you could look at just the last 2 weeks. Javonte had himself a solid game. Samaje Perine was able to assert himself in this game. And you look at this game versus the Steelers, Jalen Warren had himself a solid ball game. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility to see a Kyron Williams go in there and have himself a fantasy relevant production. But going up against Baltimore, you do have to respect that defense. But again, Kyron seemingly matchup proof where he's so dominant in the passing game as well. We saw him get 6 targets this game, bring in all 6 for 61 yards. He is going to be involved in all aspects of this Rams offense. I feel like he's matchup proof. Honestly, I do.
I'm with you. RB2 on the week. Christian McCaffrey, just a typical 140 yards from scrimmage and 2 touchdowns. Just woke up and is going to be a top 3 running back basically every week. RB3, Bijan Robinson, his first finish within the top 3. And it came up against one of the tougher matchups, right? If you would have went through the rest of the season schedule, I don't think you would have circled the Saints saying this is going to be the game. He has his best game of the season. 16 carries for 91 yards and a touchdown. 6 targets. We'd love to see 3 receptions, 32 yards, and a receiving touchdown. Beautiful ball from Desmond Ridder to Bijan Robinson, the right side of the field. Just put it right in the breadbasket. He took it to the house. And I like how Desmond Ridder targets Bijan. Like we mentioned, 6 targets. But to start the season when Ridder was the starting quarterback, Bijan's targets were 6, 5, 6, 5, 2, and 8. If you're going to be getting a minimum, what it feels like 5, 6 targets a game on top of the 15 plus carries that we're going 2-3 weeks in a row now, Arthur Smith is willing to give Bijan Robinson. Second half, Bijan is probably the guy we were expecting to see from week 1 since you took him in the top 10. But all in all, I think you will see him going forward be one of the best running backs, not just for fantasy football, but for real life too. To get through a few others, Isaiah Pacheco was RB4 in the week, had 2 touchdowns on 21 touches, less than 100 total yards. But when it came to that end zone, that red zone area, he was the guy. RB5 in the week is Josh Jacobs, 20 carries for 110 yards and a touchdown. Also hauled in 4 receptions. He has a bye week, but then coming up for the playoffs is going to be Minnesota, whose defense has improved, but I think still beatable. Josh Jacobs has been really solid. The Chargers, that's all day. Kansas City's been tough, but then Indianapolis Colts championship weekend. Josh Jacobs, it's another year. Doesn't matter if it's a holdout contract, whatever. He's just going to be fantasy relevant. RB6, though, Tony Pollard. Are we back in? Back-to-back weeks with a touchdown. He had that 8-game touchdown drought, but now these last 2, of course, got into the end zone, 79 rushing yards, 5 receptions for 24 yards as well. Are you back into Tony Pollard being top 15-ish rest of the season?
It's kind of seeming that way. Solid matchups back to back. Carolina, that one was like the gimme. Oh, this is his breakout week. We're anticipating that he has a good game. Going up against Washington, another gimme matchup where you don't have to worry about the defensive tackle anymore. You don't have to worry about Sweat, Chase. These guys are no longer with the team. You anticipated that Tony Pollard would be involved, but what has been the most eye-opening aspect of Tony Pollard's production has been the passing work. Two weeks in a row, we've seen him have 5 targets, 6 targets respectively, 4 catches, 6 catches, brought in all 6 this past weekend. Hasn't been for the most yardage, 19 yards and 24 yards respectively again, but again, we're seeing him get into the end zone. Rushing the football has been very efficient. Averaged over 5 yards per carry against Carolina, averaged over 6 yards per carry against Washington. If he's going to continue to be this efficient, no doubt about it, but you look at the matchups rest of the season, Seattle, I think that's a game that we can look that Tony Pollard can get his. Philadelphia, don't love it. I don't love a matchup versus Philadelphia. Their rush defense has been money all season long, but going up against Buffalo, Miami, and Detroit 10 the season, I like that Buffalo matchup. Miami's one of those that very under the radar. They've been really good at stopping the run, just limited Brees Hall to a guy that we probably should mention in our duds section, but will be nice to Jets because they honestly are just faced with some very unfortunate luck. But Miami's rush defense really has been under the radar, very solid, especially two running backs for fantasy football. And then Detroit, who's another one that I just don't feel comfortable starting the running backs versus Detroit, where their secondary, they're going to give up a ton of yards regardless. But that rush defense really is still one of the cream of the crop of the league. So you got two matchups here that you really do like, but then there's a bunch of matchups in between that really aren't in Tony's favor. I think you have to trust Tony because of how scarce the running back position is. You have no choice but to put him in your lineup. But I think it's kind of tempering expectations just a little bit. Even though Tony Pollard should be a fantasy dream, in theory, it hasn't been that for the majority of this year.
And at RB7 is a guy that I think some people thought would have been a fantasy dream this year. Kind of been up and down, but recently been on fire. Ramondre Stevenson. The Patriots are a mess. The quarterback situation is a mess. Bill Belichick and the coaching staff's a mess. But Ramondre finds a way to be relevant. 21 carries for 98 yards and a touchdown. 5 receptions. It was like 14 yards, but 5 receptions is going to boost you a bit there too. Since week 6, RB6, 15, 38 bad week, RB2, RB20, RB7. He's got a couple juicy matchups coming up too. He's got the Chargers next week, got Denver in week 16. So another player where we're kind of talking about opposites between Pollard and Ramondre, where Pollard is kind of the, I don't want to say last option, but secondary option, of course, behind CeeDee Lamb in the passing attack, but on a great offense. Yep. And you have Ramondre Stevenson, who is probably going to get the most looks, the most touches on this team, but on a bad offense. So I know you've been a big fan of Ramondre Stevenson. Do you think rest of season is him and Tony Pollard? Who would you rather have between those two?
Oh, between him and Tony, that's tough. I look at the matchups, and I just finished talking about how Miami's rush defense has been solid. In all those weeks that you listed, you had the one outlier of running back 38. Guess who that team was? The Miami Dolphins. Other than that, he's been pretty awesome. And you have matchups versus the Chargers, Pittsburgh, Kansas City, who's a great defense. Don't love that one. But then Denver and Buffalo. Denver, who's been a good defense, their rush defense is still a liability. And Buffalo, if the score gets ugly quickly, we can see that Ramondre kind of will get left back. But again, we're seeing Ramondre be used in the passing game where it's not efficient. If you're in PPR leagues, you got 5 points today just off of him catching the ball. And that's going to be what we've seen out of him for these last few weeks, that he really has gotten back to fantasy relevance. If you want to say Tony Pollard, I understand because he is in the better offense, but just matchup-wise and for how good we've seen Ramondre be over these last 4 to 5 weeks, part of me does lean Ramondre.
To round out the top guys of the week, we have Raheem Mostert as RB8. Without HN, he's a workhorse, 20 carries for 94 yards and 2 touchdowns. RB9, Jonathan Taylor, 15 carries, 91 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Still not really getting involved in the passing game. Didn't get any targets, no receptions. But it's hard not to love what you've seen from him. These last 3 weeks, he's playing 70% or more of the snaps, and it's been RB8, 17, and RB9 going into Monday Night Football, and has a touchdown each of the last 2 weeks. The Colts, Shane Steichen, Gardner Minshew. The offense is more than respectable for Jonathan Taylor to be able to be a top 10 running back rest of season. At RB10, Derrick Henry. This was a matchup that I know you were loving. If we would have had our starts of the week, I'm sure either me or you would have made him our star of the week, going up against a terrible Panthers defense. 18 carries for 75 yards and 2 touchdowns. A couple other guys. Chuba Hubbard was RB11. I'm not buying too much into that. James Cook, RB12. Najee Harris, RB13. First game without Matt Canada. And we saw Najee get the most opportunities. Him and Jalen Warren, this is why I never really bought into this. This guy's a starter. This guy isn't the starter. I think both of them are startable on a weekly basis, given this nature of the running back landscape. And this was the first time in, what was it, since the week 2 of 2020, was it, that the Steelers had 400 plus yards of offense. So obviously moving off of Matt Canada was the right move. Najee Harris, I thought looked pretty decent today. So before we go on to RB duds, we talked a little bit about Bijan Robinson. I know how high you were on him rested or coming into the season. So I want to know for rest of season if you would rather have Bijan or these running backs I'm going to name.
All right, let's do it.
Bijan Robinson or Jonathan Taylor.
Oh, goodness gracious. Got to respect JT. JT is just the better player right now. I'll go Jonathan.
Bijan Robinson or Travis Etienne.
Bijan Robinson. Travis Etienne these last few weeks has been nowhere near the level of football player that we've seen him at the beginning of the season. I lean Bijan Robinson.
Bijan Robinson or Jahmyr Gibbs.
Jahmyr is another one where we're seeing him get involved in the pass game heavily, but Bijan's going to have a little bit more opportunity. We saw his usage, at least today, where Algier really, he got his, but nowhere near the workload that we saw Bijan get. But Demont's always going to be looming in the background. I'm definitely leaning Bijan in this situation, but Jahmyr's been really good this year as well.
What about Alvin Kamara?
I got to respect Alvin. Alvin's just getting abused in the passing game so long as Derek Carr is the quarterback. Coming back from suspension, for him to even be anywhere near a top 10 running back when you're suspended 3 games, you know you have to be at a different level. Got to respect AK here.
And then the last one, who is just RB1 on the week, Kyren Williams.
Got to go Kyren. I mean, again,
go with Kyren over Bijan.
I'm going Kyren. 5 matchups where he has finished as a top 10 running back, and he's missed 4 weeks. He has been otherworldly when he's been on the football field. Listen, Bijan is a better player than Kyren, but when it comes to fantasy football and production, Kyren Williams is right there with the best of them. As long as your name is not Christian McCaffrey, he is right there in those conversations. I mean that sincerely. Now, let me ask you, Joel, what are your answers to these?
I think, because I see the comments too, I think I'm taking Bijan over everybody but Jonathan Taylor.
Okay, I respect that. Over AK as well.
Over even AK. If Bijan's going to get this type of workload, this is the guy that was going in the first round draft. This is the guy that we thought could be a top 3 fantasy running back. CMC is the only guy that I'm like, no doubt about it, I'm taking CMC over Bijan. But I think almost every other running back you could have a conversation with.
What about Kyren? I mean, almost 200.
Kyren's right there too. He would be in that conversation. I said he's top 10 might be a little bit too generous. We might be talking top 5, the type of workload that Kyren gets.
You're not even joking. All right, so let's move on to a little bit sadder conversation. The RB duds. We spoke about Breece Hall. He didn't have himself that productive of a Miami game. But again, we're going to be kinder to the Jets players, even though Garrett Wilson had himself a sneaky good game versus Miami. But the first dud we're going to mention is going to be Saquon. Finishes as RB41, only 6.2 fantasy points, 12 rushes, 46 yards. Did bring in a catch for 6 yards. He has been relatively solid. I don't want to say he's matchup proof because obviously going up against the Patriots, it seemed as if the game plan was let's put the ball in DeVito's hands and let him make some plays. We'll limit Saquon as much as we can. But again, only 12 attempts too, which is shocking to me. Usually they rely heavily on Saquon in these situations. That simply wasn't the case today. I still feel confident starting Saquon moving forward. Jalen Warren versus Cincinnati. This is one that I want to have a little bit of a conversation about because you spoke about Najee being a top 15 back this week. And last week, where we saw Jalen Warren finish as a top 3 guy, this week finishes at RB 35, 7.2 fantasy points, 13 rushes, 49 yards, had 3 catches, 13 yards, did have a fumble. Now, what you said that you feel like these 2 guys are startable moving forward. Are you not thinking too much about this one? To me, it kind of stings because we saw back-to-back weeks of Jalen Warren be really good. And then going up against Cincinnati, who, in terms of stopping the run, really haven't been that great. I thought it was written in the stars for Jalen to have himself a nice ball game. It was kind of opposite. We saw Najee Harris have one of his better games of the season. You're not thinking too much about this, or is this something to keep in mind moving forward?
It's just impossible to predict. It feels like whoever is going to get into the end zone is going to be the running back who has the higher weekly finish. I mean, I'm not rewriting or, reinventing the wheel here by saying that, but both of these players are going to get around the same amount of touches, right? We said even before the whole, Jalen Warren and Najee Harris, they were basically going back and forth. Najee had on average 2 or 3 more touches per game as the quote unquote starter. So Jalen Warren through 2 weeks as the quote unquote starter, I think has still had less total touches than Najee Harris. So it felt like more than anything, it was just coach speak from Mike Tomlin, who, whether it was trying to get a rise out of Najee Harris or maybe just congratulating and giving the respect and
Due
credit to
diligence,
Jalen
for
Warren,
sure.
who's had a great season so far, because when it comes to actual on-field opportunities, it's been about the same for both of these guys. So I think they both have traits in this Pittsburgh offense. Looked a lot better this week, like we mentioned earlier. They both have traits that can make them fantasy relevant, especially through the passing game. But Najee Harris, 15 for 99. This was, in my opinion, probably his best game of the season and got into the end zone. So Najee's not going to go away. Jalen Warren's not going to go away. I think, as we mentioned all season long in the fantasy, the running back landscape that it is, both of these guys are going to be startable.
And they got Arizona next week. I'm not
It's
thinking
food.
too much about it. Jalen Warren's going right into the lineup, no doubt about it. Next name I want to mention, last name I want to mention, Brian Robinson versus the Cowboys. RB 31, did have 15 attempts, 53 yards, 2 catches, 11 yards. The volume was there, just didn't have the production to match. 8.4 fantasy points. Going up against the Cowboys, I think script also went against Brian. I know I just bring up his name because we did have that conversation last week between him and Devin Singletary, who didn't have himself that bad of a ball game either. But I'm acknowledging that going up against teams that are gonna dominate offensively next week, the Miami Dolphins come into town. It's going to be one of those situations where I expect the Dolphins to put up points against the Commanders, and then you worry about Brian Robinson's situation, whether he's going to get weaned out of the offense or just not see the volume that he should be seeing in a matchup that's relatively close.
Yeah, Brian Robinson's an RB2 disguised as an RB1 because he's been healthy all season long. He hasn't had his bye week. He's plays on average about 50% of snaps. And these previous 2 weeks where he was RB1 and RB11 is when Antonio Gibson was out. So he was getting the receiving game work. Antonio Gibson is back. He played the Dallas Cowboys. Great defense. Game script wasn't in his favor. So the disappointment, I think the dud should have been, something you should have saw coming. And then this week again, going up against Miami, you've talked about it this episode that they've been, sneaky, pretty elite at stopping the Russia game or just fantasy running backs in general. So not a matchup I'm thrilled about.
Nope, no doubt about it. Let's move on to our wide receiver studs of week 12, sir.
Wide receiver 1, yet again, Tyreek Hill.
Legend.
Didn't do a ton on Sauce. Only 1 reception allowed. Got thrown in there, but 9 receptions for 102 yards and a touchdown. He has Washington and Titans and the Tennessee Titans the next 2 weeks. He might put up some historical numbers. Those are probably 2 of the worst secondaries in the league. Tyreek Hill and that Miami offense is going to go crazy. Wide receiver 2 on the week was Mike Evans, 6 receptions for 70 yards and 2 touchdowns. He also got tackled at the 1-yard line, could have had a 3-touchdown game. He is now up to 7 touchdowns on the season and wide receiver 11 overall. Wide receiver 3, Rashee Rice, 10 targets, 8 receptions for 107 yards, had a 39-yard receiving touchdowns where you saw some of that speed and explosiveness that this Chiefs offense is desperately missing. Was this the breakout game we've been waiting on with Rashee Rice? Was this the game where the 100 yards is finally here? Double-digit targets. Is this the game where Patrick Mahomes is going to look at him saying, going forward, like, you are without a doubt going to be my number 2 guy in this offense?
Listen, I was talking to you before. I don't like Kansas City, but something about Rashee. I kind of like Rashee. He's got some juice to him. He's got some good hands. He's got some good speed to him. Obviously, some solid size, 6'2", 203. Rashee Rice is going to be the Chiefs wide receiver 1 for the future, or the foreseeable future, in my opinion. This was that breakout game, and I think it was one of those that the Chiefs kind of just needed that slap in the face. Hey, why aren't we leaning on Rashee more? Why are we trying to force it all over the field, try and spread the wealth when we have a guy that we can rely on? I know that rookie wide receivers really haven't predominantly dominated in Andy Reid's system in the past. I think the best we've seen someone perform was a Deshaun Jackson. We know the level that Deshaun Jackson played at. And even then, I don't think the numbers were even that crazy. I'm not sure if he broke over 900 receiving yards that season. So really, we haven't seen rookies break out or really be dominant for Andy Reid's system, but we're seeing Rashee Rice put together a solid season, especially for a rookie campaign. And to have over 107 against the Las Vegas defense, who's been playing relatively well over these last couple of weeks, albeit mediocre competition outside of the Dolphins, you got to respect Rashee and think, yeah, this is the game that we're going to look at thinking going forward. This is the Chiefs wide receiver 1.
Moving on to wide receiver 4, Devonta Smith, 7 receptions, did get over 100 yards and get the 99-yard cheese and a touchdown. Last 2 weeks, over 200 total yards and 13 receptions. Without Dallas Goedert, I think it's clear that he gets a pretty significant boost in this offense.
No doubt.
A.J. Brown got into the end zone, so kind of saved his day because outside of that, it was a bit disappointing. Wide receiver 5, Nico Collins, second game back from injury. He's back into the top 5, 7 receptions for 104 yards and a touchdown. I think him and Tank Dell, you could probably look at his top 15 options rest of the season. That's how potent this Texans wide receiver or this Texans passing attack is. They do have Denver and the Jets the next 2 weeks, so you probably have to temper expectations. I would expect Nico Collins to get PS2 since he predominantly plays on the outside, and then we know the Jets have been able to slow down opposing offenses. But even still, I'm starting these guys. I'm starting Nico Collins. He's just been too dominant. Wide receiver 6, Gabe Davis. This was the phantom Gabe Davis game that I guess he was due for. 12 targets, 6 receptions, 100 yards, and a touchdown. Wide receiver 7, Deebo Samuel. 9 targets, which is most since week 3. Turned them to 7 receptions for 79 yards. Also rushed the ball for four times for 15 yards and a touchdown. 2 out of the last 3 games has a rushing touchdown now. Philly, Seattle, Arizona the next 3 weeks. So all of these pass catchers, Deebo, Ayuk, George Kittle, and of course, Brock Purdy at quarterback have a very nice schedule upcoming. Wide receiver 8, it's going to be someone I feel like we have to talk about every single week, but Calvin Ridley. I don't want to start off his stud with negativity, but he did drop a 30-yard touchdown that would have propelled him to probably wide receiver 1 overall in the week. But this whole Zay Jones thing, it has to be true. Zay Jones was yet again active, and Calvin Ridley goes 5 receptions for 89 yards and a touchdown. Now his upcoming schedule, Cincinnati, Cleveland, and Baltimore, is pretty brutal. You don't like it at all. Does it bother you, or are you just lowering expectations, but he's still in your lineup? How would you treat Calvin Ridley rest of the season?
I don't want to say that he's kind of teasing managers because back-to-back weeks we're seeing him explode finally. We were anticipating this all season, but waiting for it to be on a consistent basis. And now that the schedule kind of heats up, I think we're starting to see this Jaguars offense heat up. And I feel like that's specifically the passing offense because, again, like I mentioned early on, ETN hasn't been that same dominant force. But what it's reminiscent of was early in Joe Burrow's career when I'm talking about year 2 Burrow, where we saw Mixon be one of the most dominant running backs in the league. But then as the year kind of went on, we saw Mixon kind of fade into the background. But the passing offense from the Bengals was electric. We saw Jamar, we saw T. We really started to see them move the ball vertically down the field in the air. And now kind of similarly here, the last 2 weeks, albeit these matchups aren't the greatest. Of course, Tennessee, their secondary, we're very vocal about it. Not good. If you are a manager of a player that's going up against Tennessee, specifically in the receiver or quarterback section, start them. And then going up against the Texans, whose defense hasn't been the greatest either, you still have to go out there and produce. And what we've seen out of Trevor Lawrence and this pass offense is they're producing. So I think I have to go off what's been trending, and what the trend is, Calvin Ridley's here.
Absolutely. So to round out the top 10 here, we have Michael Pittman at wide receiver 9, one of the most consistent wide receivers all season long. He hasn't finished outside of the top 16 since week 5. Today had 13 targets, 10 receptions for 107 yards against Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And wide receiver 10 was Christian Watson. I was not expecting this. 5 receptions for 94 yards and a touchdown. That first drive, he had over 50 yards, which would have been the second most on the season if he just stopped after the first drive. I'm not completely buying into Christian Watson. I am buying a bit into the Packers offense as a whole. I think as you go on with all these young players, you're just bound to get more chemistry. But Christian Watson has shown to probably be the least consistent on a game-to-game, snap-by-snap basis. I'm looking at Romeo Doubs. I'm looking at Jaden Reed as guys that I think long-term will probably be better options. But Christian Watson, of course, has that game-breaking ability. And just around a couple of other guys who had some nice performances. Jacoby Myers, 79 yards and a touchdown. Jalen Waddle, RB12, went over 100 yards. And then Stephon Diggs bounced back, had a couple of real stinkers. And nobody cares because it's Stephon Diggs. But I'm sure since you drafted him in the back of the first or early second rounds, you wanted to see this back. 7 yards and had a beautiful touchdown. Josh Allen just had a very special throw, rolling to his left, threw it across his body, an absolute dot right on the end zone. So that rounds up our wide receiver studs.
All right, let's move on to our wide receiver duds. Some solid names here. DK Metcalf versus the Niners finishes as wide receiver 65, 6.2 fantasy points, 32 yards, had 9 targets, only brought in 3 catches. That Niners secondary, man, I guess that it's here and it's back. They really played a great ball game against Seattle. Maybe the Niners just have Seattle's number, but they weren't able to do anything. Chris Godwin going up against Indianapolis finishes as wide receiver 52. Is it time to have a conversation about Chris Godwin? He's been kind of mid this season, and now maybe we can talk about it maybe where Baker can't backpack 2 great wide receiver finishes, because you look at Mike Evans, you talked about it, just outside the top 10 so far in the grand scheme of things. He's been awesome, has 7 touchdowns this season. But then you look at Chris Godwin, I mentioned, has been quiet, was quiet this week. In the last 4 weeks, no finishes in the top 30. And in all of those games, did not have double digits in any of them, is currently wide receiver 37. Not one of these guys that you anticipate to be playing this poorly. Chris Godwin, he had been one of the more talented, not spoken about wide receivers in the league. At one point, we were talking about him as a top 10 wide receiver in the National Football League. That's how talented and how much the production was matching the talent there. But we haven't seen that side of Chris Godwin so far this year.
I think the sample size is probably large enough now that we're 12 weeks into the season to kind of see what it is, right? Tampa Bay Buccaneers, it's Mike Evans, his number 1 receiver and option, and Rachaad White. For however much shit I want to give him as a rusher, he is so utilized in this offense, both as a rusher and as a receiver. And Chris Godwin right now is kind of that third forgotten option, even on a week-by-week basis. He could get more targets than Rachaad White, but then you bring into all of the carries he gets. He is the third option in this offense. So when you're the third option on an offense led by Baker Mayfield, I think this 12-week sample size saying that Chris Godwin is going to be a weekly flex. If you have to start him, it's not the end of the world, but he's probably not going to give you much upside. So I think there's probably some better options either on your bench or maybe even on the waiver wire.
Last 2 guys I'm going to mention, you spoke about it earlier on the show. Both of them are on the same team. I'm talking about those guys over there with the Ramley, Mr. Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp. Now, Puka, I'm a little less worried about. We're still talking about a top 10 wide receiver in fantasy football. Had 8 targets, 4 catches for 27 yards. Did finish as wide receiver 58. Now, Cooper Kupp, very interesting here. 5 targets, 3 catches, 18 yards. Since week 7, wide receiver 53, 74, 49, 86, and 75 this past week. Is Cooper Kupp a must start, Joel?
It's tough. We were just talking about this watching the game with Joey. I'll say this. I'm also a bit worried about Puka Nacua at this point because since Cooper Kupp has come back, he's had 1 good game, right? Last week when he was wide receiver 13, Cooper Kupp got injured. So they're both it's so strange because this offense was absolutely rolling all day long. And maybe because they had so much success on the ground, Royce Freeman was even phenomenal. He was super efficient that they didn't feel the need or even really because Matt Stafford had 4 passing touchdowns, but only had 200 and change in terms of passing. It was 230, I think he was around. So it's not like they were just slinging the ball all over the place. Tutu Atwell was getting involved. Tyler Higbee had a couple of touchdowns. So it felt like this was more of an outlier game. But we haven't seen a good Cooper Kupp game in a long time. We're talking about going over a month. And we've seen, like I mentioned, really just 1 good game from Puka without Cooper Kupp. Both of these guys are so talented, and they've both shown in their own rights for, Cooper Kupp, historical season, Puka Nacua, best start to an NFL career in history, that they seem too good to be this poor rest of season. But then you look at their next 2 weeks with Cleveland and the Baltimore Ravens. You probably have to start both, including Cooper Kupp, but I wouldn't call you crazy if you're looking elsewhere.
All right, sir. So you know what that means. I'm gonna list you a bunch of receivers. You tell me who would you rather have rest of the season, Cooper Kupp or the following receiver. First receiver, Tank Dell.
I'd rather have Tank Dell.
I can't blame you too much. Tank Dell is
He's been
a dominant
unbelievable.
force in that offense. He's been amazing. Christian Kirk.
Give me Cooper Kupp. I'll take the chance.
Brandon Ayuk.
Ayuk's tough because he doesn't get consistent targets in terms
He
of
doesn't.
when Cooper Kupp is on, he's getting 10 plus targets a game. But what he's been doing, he's been a high end wide receiver too. I'd lean Cooper Kupp there still.
You're respecting the hell out of him, and I respect you for that. Devontae Adams.
Today's another tough one where Jacoby Myers had another game where he outperformed him, but the week prior he was doing fine. These guys are both pretty close. I think I still trust Cooper Kupp.
Okay. All right. I understand that. All right. Let's go on the guy in the same team, Jacoby Myers.
I have to go Cooper Kupp. I don't feel good about it, but I feel like if I'm taking him over Tay, I had to take him over Jacoby.
Okay. Drake London.
I would say Cooper Kupp.
All right. Drake London has been very sneakily having himself a solid season. You look at his games in the last, let's say since the week 4, we're talking about 14 fantasy points versus New Orleans. That's honestly impressive because New Orleans has a solid secondary. One of those guys that I wasn't thinking about starting, but hey, as a flex piece, maybe I should have. 11 points versus Tennessee, 11 points versus Tampa Bay, 22 versus Washington, 15 versus Houston, and 12 versus Jacksonville. He has been a pretty strong model of consistency. So that's the only reason I bring up his name. Part of me feels like I'd rather go consistency than upside, because upside, it's not even a question. We're talking about it being Cooper Kupp, but it seems as if his body's not holding up with him right now. And then on top of it, you do have other parts of this offense that it doesn't need to be so reliant upon Cooper Kupp. So I'm just saying I wouldn't call you crazy if you lean Drake, but of course, it's Cooper Kupp.
Would you take Drake?
I can't say I would. I can't say I would.
I agree.
But it is definitely one of those that I am not closing my mind to it because of how. Now, let me ask you, Puka Nacua or Drake London?
I'll say this. I want to go back. I would take Brandon Ayuk over Cooper Kupp. I just looked at Brandon Ayuk's rest of season schedule.
I agree.
That's beautiful.
I agree. I agree.
Puka Nacua or Drake London. I still have faith in Puka. Like I still like that start of season where he was just the absolute best receiver we had seen as a rookie, just burst onto the scene. I still think he has that in him. But these next few weeks are so brutal that if you're not doing it against the Cardinals and Stafford's out there throwing for 4 touchdowns, you have over 400 total yards of offense. What makes me think you're going to do it against, Cleveland and Baltimore, two of the best defenses in the league? So, shit, man, maybe I go Drake London.
All right. I respect it. Drake London's that boy. So I need a little bit of acknowledge on him. We'll move on. But yeah, bro, it really is kind of messed up how Cooper Kupp's situation has gone from probably the best we've ever seen, at least fantasy receiver production, to we're having conversations about him being startable. And that really isn't more so to do with the talent, because we know he's talented, but it has to do with injuries. And that's really what has been hindering his production so far from last season and unfortunately into this year. Let's talk some tight ends, sir.
So tight ends, tight end 1 of the week, as we all expected, Pat Freiermuth, his second game back from injury. My guy, Pat Freiermuth, and puts up a career high in receptions with 9 and receiving yards with 120. Funny enough, I actually started Pat Freiermuth in our Dynasty League because I had Luke Musgrave, and that was my only other choice. So I got the huge game for Pat Freiermuth. the Steelers offense looked good. I know the points weren't there, but they were able to move the ball. So I think everyone in this offense gets a step up. Tyler Higbee, 29 yards, but 2 touchdowns. That gets you tight end 2 on the week. Tight end 3 with Sam Laporta, who goes 5 for 47 and a touchdown. Travis Kelce, a bit of a bounce back, 6 for 91. Not the insane game from Travis Kelce, but good to see him at least pick it up because these last couple of weeks have been a bit of a disappointment. Tight end 5, Trey McBride, 7 receptions for 60 yards. He's just been one of the most reliable tight ends over this last month to 6 weeks.
Love him.
Tight end 6, David Njoku, another really strong performance these last 3 weeks. 6 receptions for 58 yards, 7 receptions for 56 yards, and 6 receptions for 59 yards. Now, DTR did get injured in this game, and it seems like there's a strong possibility that it will be PJ Walker next week. Because DTR is dealing with concussion, and as we know, that usually means you're out for at least 1 week. So David Njoku is probably not startable with PJ Walker from what we've seen this season. And honestly, the rest of these tight ends, not really worth mentioning. I mean, they're poking up 40, 50 yards, but the top guys that produce, Laporta, Kelce, Trey McBride, roll in there. Tyler Higbee had a very strange inactive, and then, the Rams screwed up. He's actually playing. It was a bit surprising when I saw him on the field and score a touchdown. We were driving to go get food, and I said I didn't know Tyler Higbee was playing this game. But yeah, the tight ends, a couple of the guys stood out, but we can get into some of these duds too.
Yeah, the only real notable duds, Jake Ferguson again finds himself on this list. Tight end 25, 4.5 fantasy points. Kyle Pitts against the Saints, tight end 27. And then Dalton Schultz versus the Jaguars, tight end 53, 1.2 fantasy points. That means he had a catch in 6 yards. Not ideal. Dalton Schultz going up against the Jags, who their secondary really has not been that good. And Dalton Schultz, who's been pretty solid, I'm surprised that he was the odd man out left out of this offense. But tight ends, you know how they go. 1 week, you're at the top of the league. The next week, you could be tight end 53 like a Dalton Schultz. It really is the ebbs and flows of the tight end fantasy position. Now, let's move on to the last part of the show. We're going to talk, last 2 parts of the show. We'll read Super Chats, and then we'll get into waivers. First Super Chat comes from Can't Stop Laughing. His comment, shout out to the donation, of course, but he says Josh Allen is 3 at best. Hurts and Mahomes are better. The Bills are the 76ers. Good comp.
Mm-hmm.
Can't beat the best teams or go on deep playoff runs. Listen, Josh Allen saying he's 3 at best. Don't disrespect him. He really has been playing at an insane level all season. If you don't like the turnovers, I can't say I blame you overly, but what turnovers mean to me when you're Josh Allen, it could be 2 things. And one, to me, more than anything, it means confidence. You're trying to fit balls in windows that not many other quarterbacks can. You believe in yourself that much. Sometimes it leads into interceptions. But when it leads to plays like the one we saw against the Jets, where Sauce Gardner's fingers are as stretched out as humanly possible, and he fits it into that tight window to Shakir and ends up being an over 70-yard touchdown, that's why you live with the interceptions, because you know you have a quarterback that has a special arm like that. Josh Allen, the disrespect that gets put on his name to me sometimes is a bit unwarranted. He is one of the most talented guys in the league. If you want to take Mahomes and Hurts, you're not going to get too much of an argument out of me because of how amazing Hurts has been. And, of course, Mahomes is stamped. But Josh Allen is at worst number 3 right now. Shout out to David, $10 donation. You're a legend. Says, who y'all going for? Niners or Eagles next week? Got to stay solid with the Birds. Niners have been playing some really good football. I think the Niners can put up some points on the Eagles, but the Eagles are going to be able to score points against legitimately any defense. I really don't have a worry. What do you think, brother?
It's going to be hard to go against the Eagles. This is going to be their toughest test, in my opinion. I think these are the 2 best teams in football. But the Eagles got Jalen Hurts, man. The Niners are right up there. I think their defense has undoubtedly been playing better, especially over these last couple of weeks. But like I said, when Jalen Hurts has the ball, I just feel warm and cozy. I know he's going to get the W.
You know what, though? We can't say probably his toughest challenge in hindsight, but we probably anticipated that Chiefs game would be their toughest challenge. But let's be real. Chiefs, Bills, 2 tough games that they just ended up gutting out at the very end. So both were very tough matchups, but they ended up winning. Shows resiliency like we alluded to earlier on in the show. But I think that just these 3 weeks alone were the challenge. And for them to already be 2-0 in this stretch speaks volumes to the football team that is the Philadelphia Eagles. Part of me feels like I want them to lose this game so deeper down the road you don't have to worry about it. I
Yeah.
just want to see Jalen Hurts succeed. And if he falls short, it'd be disappointing just because of how awesome he is as a football player and a human being. Now, last segment of the show is going to be the waiver wire. Now, not too many names over the top, honestly. Just going to go position by position. Quarterback, there's none to be had. Let's just be transparent. Still rostered. Are you thinking about a Tajay Spears? Personally, I'm not. What do you think?
Probably not. Just real quick at quarterback, if you're in a 2 quarterback league and you're desperate, Kenny Pickett gets Arizona next week. Are
Okay.
you moving?
Don't hate that.
Or you don't hate it? Okay, because it's
I don't
ugly,
hate
it's
it.
gross, but 400-yard game, first time in 3 years. Arizona is terrible defensively, so I do think Kenny Pickett is probably one streamable name in those 2 quarterback leagues that might be out there.
I saw Kenny Pickett. I said, I don't know if he's worth mentioning, but I understand going up against Arizona. That's definitely a nice one. Is Samaje Perine worth the pickup? Last 2 weeks has had 13.7 fantasy points and 13.6 fantasy points. Is he worth the pickup in your opinion?
Do have Houston and the Chargers these next 2 weeks. If you need a running back start, I think that's probably one of the better names you're going to get available these last 3 weeks. RB35, RB17, RB17. 2 weeks ago was through the air, 7 for 60. This past week on the ground, 7 for 55. He gets utilized. You guys, as much as we kind of want Javonte to be that workhorse, he's still seen about 35% of snaps these last couple of weeks. So he's on the field enough to have an impact. And when you look at the other names out there, Antonio Gibson, AJ Dillon's going to go up against Kansas City next week. Tajay Spears, sure, but he's the clear RB2. There's not a ton of guys out here.
Last name I'll mention is Rico Dowdle on your radar.
Rico has week by week. I feel like ever since I heard Steph hype him up like a month ago,
true.
and all, I didn't even know, but it was Steph's guy. I feel like the more I've seen him, the more involved he's been. He got a touchdown on Thanksgiving as well. He's getting utilized more in the offense, but it's still not to the point where I could pick him up. And, if you're on a regular 5-6 man bench, I'm not going that deep into the bag. He's RB49 on the season. And still is usually seeing, 5-ish touches a game. So I'm keeping an eye on him. Maybe this is a kind of a dynasty sneaky pickup that next year Pollard's gone. Maybe Dow gets some more touches. But I think for this year, it's still Pollard's job pretty comfortably.
All right, moving on to wide receiver. Jalen Hyatt, who had himself over 100 yards this week. We know that he's that deep play, that burner wide receiver, only rostered in 11% of leagues. Are you intrigued? Are you interested at all?
Not really. No, I'm not. Tommy DeVito, I'm still not bought into the Giants offense at all. Had a couple of nice wins. You take it. It's encouraging for sure, especially if you drafted him in dynasty leagues, just to see that, the draft capital, the skill, and now the production is kind of finally all coming together. Has the big game, had a couple really nice catches. You saw the explosiveness, but for a redraft league going into the playoffs, I don't think Jalen Hyatt's going to be someone that I'd roster.
Now, we saw Greg Dortch get into the end zone. 2 weeks in a row, we're seeing him double-digit fantasy points. Is not even rostered in 10% of leagues. Is Dortch becoming one of those that you throw a $0 bid, you see if you can get him on your team just because of Kyler Murray?
Not all that moved. I mean, to his, defense, he really didn't play at all to start off the year. And then these last 2 weeks is when he's actually been on the field and he has been a bit productive. But I'm still not buying into Greg Dortch for fantasy.
Okay, I can understand that. And tight end, if Freiermuth's available, which he probably shouldn't be, but is not rostered in 50% of leagues, go ahead and get yourself Freiermuth. Tyler Higbee, I don't know if I'm buying too much into his 2-touchdown performance. I think that's just Arizona. Gerald Everett, another one who has been an all right guy, rests like just as is, not rostered. Had himself a great ball game against Baltimore. Did get into the end zone. Did have 43 receiving yards. I feel like the tight end position, it's so hit or miss. I don't love Gerald Everett. next week going up against New England, then has Denver the week after that. I don't know. What do you think?
No, not just in Gerald Everett. Doesn't get utilized enough. Yeah.
Tight end's just one of those that what are you going to do?
I respect you trying. I respect you throwing out a name.
But that's going to do it from us over here at the Fantasy Reaction Show. Episode 24 does come to a conclusion. We'll be back here, of course, on Thursday. We took off for the holidays. You can't blame us too much. I hope you guys started the right guys. But before we wrap up, for those that are still with us, we appreciate you. If you guys are still sticking around, go ahead and drop a like on this video. It helps us out a ton. If you guys aren't subscribed to the YouTube channel, what are you guys doing? Go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Turn on that notification bell so you know when we go live like nights like tonight. But again, that's going to do it from us over here from the Fantasy Reaction. We'll see you guys next time.